Good morning, everybody, and welcome. As Don said, you're going to hear a story from us today. It's a story of passion and mission. It's a story of preparedness and some unpreparedness. And it's a story of success and just a little bit of pride. On June 12th of this year, our LGBT and our Latin communities experienced and were victims of the worst mass shooting in U.S. history. You're going to hear some stories from our front line, but before you do, we want to play for you a short video that we developed really as part of our teaching imperative that we feel the need to share with the world, and also for us as a little bit of healing.
Sunday, June 12th, 2016. The time, 02:03.
911, what's the location of your emergency?
In the Pulse in Orlando.
My friend got shot in the bathroom.
There's a lot of dead people.
There's multiple people in there.
Shooting, and there's a lot of people dead. He said he can't talk.
I couldn't feel my legs. I tried to get to the exit. I was dragging myself to the exit. I couldn't feel my feet.
The music cut off and it went silent, and all you heard was gunshots. Instantly, I knew right there that this was bad. We're trapped in here. Just as I thought, he came and he started laughing, and then he just started shooting through the door, and everybody fell to the ground like all at once.
Felt heat all over my body, just heat. But I didn't know exactly where I got shot, but I was holding my stomach most of the time.
The last thing I remember, they were carrying me by all the limbs, and they took me into the back of the truck.
3 hours of terror overnight, multiple shootouts, hostages.
Just really can't describe the feeling right now. It's, being back out here. I mean, I haven't stepped on this property since that night. Ones that were showing signs that they were responsive, I would talk to them. I said, hey, I'm here to help you out. Just hang in there, hang in there.
All I remember was waking up in the middle of the surgery room. And I just remember looking back and forth and just seeing blood and bodies next to me, basically. I was trying to take in any drop of air I could get. I remember I was just vomiting blood like crazy. My whole body was just covered in blood.
It was so loud, and I just remember definitely hearing all the doctors. You could hear them, you could hear that they were frantic, you could hear all the patients screaming.
The magnitude of what came in, I don't think that any of us were prepared for.
We see a lot of gunshots and stabbings. This was different in that he had both high velocity and low velocity firearms. And the high velocity carry a lot more destruction of the tissue with them.
You have to not be distracted by the size of the wound and look at how the patient is doing.
This was on a scale far beyond what we ever expected to have to deal with.
I went into the family room and I said, "Can I have your attention?" I said, I'm going to put my email address up and I want you to send me a photograph of who you're looking for. To constantly see pictures of people, but please help me find my mother. She's the mother of 11, and she's out with my brother. She was out with my brother who's gay. Can you help me find my father, my uncle?
You hear him reading names and conditions of the patients that we had here.
Next, Brian Garabello, critical. Paula Blanco, stable.
You hear sighs of relief. You hear sighs of anguish. I mean, one of the things that we learned was you need to have someone with a clinical background staying in the family rooms because people would faint. When the list was read, we said we have 4 here that we haven't yet identified. And then all the families were like, well, what about mine?
A memory that I will never get out of my head. It's the picture of 5 really clean, white, shiny medical examiner vans. And one at a time in synchrony, one backs up and leaves and goes out to Orange Avenue, and another one backs up and goes out. There's 1 or 2 people in each one of these vans, and it's over just like that. It's 6 a.m. and it's just over like that for them.
Every patient that made it into the OR to have surgery survived. Every single one.
We took in 35 alive, and we still have 35 alive.
No patients have succumbed to their injuries since the initial 9 patients who came to us at the time of the shooting. All of the patients since arrival to the hospital are still with us.
I would say drill. I would say practice. Have a plan, okay? You know, if you fail to plan, then you're planning to fail.
There was a tremendous amount of preparation. There's a tremendous amount of training. I don't know how to explain some of the things that were just the way they needed to be, other than there had to have been some grace. There were the right people in the right place so many times through the night.
To have the outcomes that we did, I mean, it's truly remarkable, truly a work of God and a work of all the team members that came together to help, you know, from EMS to the police to ER to the OR.
I'm surrounded by heroes. I'll never forget this. For the rest of my life, I will never forget what they did.
We immediately made the decision to hold all the bills. And I think it's our culture of compassion in the organization.
One night that week, I went out, got in my car, and it was quiet. Like a wave of emotion hit me, and I realized that, you know, everything that the counselors had been talking about was, you know, for me.
It's when you're quiet and by yourself, that's when things get hard. And honestly, I have been seeing a counselor. It took me about a month to get to that point because I'm a strong surgeon, I'm confident, right? Not really, but you know, I don't need help. That's for the residents and that's for the nursing staff. I was wrong.
The higher I get in leadership, the more I realize that there's hardly anything I can do on my own. The night of June 12th, Orlando Health received 44 victims within 2 hours and performed 28 surgeries. As of today, we've performed 71 surgeries on these patients. And thanks to the skill of our clinical team and the grace of God, no patient has died since the early morning hours when this tragedy first occurred.
I think we all struggled with the notion of hate, you know, manifesting in the way that it did. And I think the only way that I've been able to reconcile that for myself moving forward is just, I watched the opposite of that. I watched love and I watched compassion. I watched empathy in terms of how people cared for each other and supported each other and believed in each other. That, for me, will change me forever.
Eric, come over here. Come.
I can't really
We all got matching tattoos, and we just put them in different places, but...
We got him across the street from Pulse.
Don't stop being prepared. You know, we talk about disasters, and you've seen a lot across the United States. You've seen a lot across the world. We've got to be prepared as a nation. Are you prepared? Are you ready? And stop the fluff stuff. Stop saying I have some policy that's 13 years old that's dusty on the shelf. As a hospital, you have that obligation. So are you ready?
Oh gosh, we have another drill. You know, in the past, I've had that attitude. We all have that attitude, but it is of utmost importance. Without that planning, we wouldn't have had the chest tube to save patient X that had her chest tube here that now I saw in my office 2 weeks ago that's doing fine.
Everything is considered a blessing now to me. I got a second chance and I don't want to waste it.
I go there for my doctor's appointment, and every time I see it, I get flashbacks, but I get good flashbacks. I don't get like crazy flashbacks or scary flashbacks. I was basically born again there.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been 6 months. Thank you. It's been 6 months this week since that occurred, since that tragedy happened here in Orlando, and the emotions are still fresh. I'm going to introduce to you a team, and you're going to hear some stories from them, some of their firsthand experiences as they participated in this horrific experience, June 12th and after that. And as I tell you their personal stories, I want you to listen to the passion, and I want you to listen to their voices, because you're going to hear the voices of some of our team. There was over 500 of our team members who were involved in the care of these patients, but these folks, you're going to hear a team who's deeply devoted in what they do, and certainly deeply affected by what they had to do. To my left is Libby Brown. She's one of the frontline nurses in our trauma department. She was there as those 44 patients came through our door that early Sunday morning. And to her left is Dr. Chad Smith. He was the trauma surgeon in-house that morning, and he had to assume the responsibility of triage physician and the responsibility of delegating resources of all of the teams that were emergently taking care of those patients. And to his left is Dr. Michael Cheatham. Dr. Cheatham is our chief surgical officer. He's a 20-year veteran on our trauma team. And after he started the work of caring for those patients that morning, he then assumed a unique role that he'd not had experience in, and that was the head of the media response. And he was our frontline voice to the media. To his left is Mark Jones, a very cherished member of our team. He is the president of Orlando Regional Medical Center. And he jumped in and assumed the role of incident commander. And then finally, to his left is Holly Stewart, whose title, don't let it fool you, she's the director of patient experience for our system. But that morning and for the rest of the stays of all those patients, she was in charge of caring for the families and the loved ones of all the victims. Libby?
Okay, y'all, I'm nervous, so I'm going to do my best. But so basically, I'm just going to tell my story, how I remember it, and this is just how it sticks in my head. That night was a Saturday night, and everybody was just, we were moving around. Everything was busy. It's a normal night, busy. It's a level 1 trauma center. We're busy all weekend nights. So we'd had a good night so far. I was in the trauma room with another one of my friends, and we'd revived a trauma code, and everything was going well so far. So I thought it was about time for me to maybe go eat. So I went and looked for one of my best friends who was in charge that night. She's one of our charge nurses. Her name is Sarah. So I was looking for Sarah in the department, and I had my cell phone in my pocket, and I felt it vibrate, and I looked down at it, and it was a message from my husband, and he's an Orlando City fireman. And it just said, y'all are about to get busy. We've gotten calls for multiple gunshot wounds coming from the vicinity of Pulse. I didn't even think about how close that was to where we are. But I went and I saw Sarah standing beside the ambulance bay doors. So she was just looking out, and I went and stood beside of her, and she was just staring out, and there were police cars just flying down Orange Avenue. Just multiple police cars, which isn't odd. We've seen that before, but then she started counting them, and she lost count pretty quickly. So I figured I better go in there and get ready to help my other trauma nurse and start getting ready. We were going to get busy. And I was nervous, but not any more than, normal when I know we're going to be a little bit busy. So we were getting ready, and then I heard Dr. Smith and his surgical residents coming in from the other side of the trauma bay. And then our first patient came in, and you know, we got to work. That's what we do. You know, that's what we do in the emergency department at Orlando Health. We get to work, we work together, you know, and things go well. So we were starting, and then another patient came in. And then another patient came in, and then another patient came in, and they just kept coming. And they had wounds like I had never seen before, and I started to get really scared. And I looked in, like, at the other nurses' eyes, and they were scared too. And I was just trying to focus on what Dr. Smith was saying. I've heard his voice a million times. You know, I know what he needs and wants us to do, so I was just trying to think about that. But this was different. I knew I just needed to listen, and he was going to tell us what to do. It was going to be right. So I listened to him, and it was things he was asking me to do I've never done before, but I knew it was the right thing because that's what he does for us. He leads our team, and I trust him. So I was like, that's what's going to have to be done. Nurses were stepping outside of their roles because we had to. We were hanging blood on patients, giving meds to patients that normally we would get orders for. I just remember looking across, you know, trying to organize the trauma room, trying to help the people that were still alive, and trying to manage the people that, you know, we could not save at that time. And I remember looking across at one of my best friends and just saying, I love you.
So that night, it had been a pretty busy day. We admitted over 20 patients up until about 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had returned to my call room to try to get a little rest. And the emergency department resident called me on the phone, which is unusual because usually if we have a pager system and if there's a trauma coming in, your pager goes off. She called me on the phone and said that we were going to get between 20 plus gunshot patients. And you know, sometimes there's things that are over triaged, and so I got dressed and went down to the emergency department and expected maybe 3 or 4 gunshot wound patients, maybe that I would have to call in my backup partner. And the first patient came in, and he had been shot in the abdomen, and ordinarily we would take him immediately to the operating room. He had been shot in the abdomen and had stable vital signs. He was awake, complaining of abdominal pain. And I picked up the phone to call the operating room, and then another patient came in that was dying. I started to assign, the patients kept coming, I started to assign residents to each patient, or patients to each resident. And it was a very quick realization that this was going to be something we had never seen before. And it was clear that some of the patients were not going to survive. You know, the battlefield concepts of triage have been around since Napoleonic times, basically where the sickest patients are treated first, and those that are not as ill are you know, wait. But another concept that goes along with that is those that are in extremis or would utilize a lot of resources that are not salvageable. You know, their care must be ceased. And we study this, we train for this, but making those decisions in real life is very different. I believe, fortunately, that night, I and we as a team were able to make those decisions rather readily. But since that time, I've wondered what it says about myself as a person making a decision that person A, we're going to cease efforts on, you know, to save persons, you know, C, B, C, D, E. It's something that I'll never forget. Decisions like these have to be made, though. They have to be made to be able to salvage or save them as much life as possible. And the only way to make decisions like this is to have the training and team attitude, to know that you're going to be supported by your team members, to know that they're going to have worked with people and trained with people, to know that they trust in you, that they trust in each other. During a crisis event such as this, every person on the team is experiencing something that they have never done before. And their reliances on that education and training are all that are basically what helps them get through it. They're going to look for a leader. Those leaders need to be calm and composed, despite what they're feeling on the inside, and lead them in a way that they can follow.
We've been training and drilling and planning for mass casualty events at Orlando Regional Medical Center for over 20 years. And when Chad called me that morning about 2:20, woke me up, I really had no idea how severely our disaster plan was going to be tested over the next few hours. Our initial conversation was very brief. Chad immediately blurted out as I picked up the phone, "I have 20 gunshot wound victims coming, I need you." And that was literally the entire conversation. And so my response was equally brief. I said, "I'm on the way." And as I started to hang up, I said, "Chad, call everyone." 20 victims, when you think about a mass casualty perspective, 20 victims is relatively small. But I knew that with penetrating injuries such as these victims would have, we needed to have as much help on hand as possible. At that time, I didn't know where the shooting had occurred. I didn't know that it was at Pulse. Like many of my fellow team members, I drive to and from the hospital each day, passing by the Pulse Nightclub. It's just 3 blocks from the hospital. And as I took my usual route to the hospital, I was struck by the presence of police cars and blue flashing lights at every single intersection, and that was clearly abnormal. And as I drove through the first police roadblock and wondered whether I was going to be stopped, I eventually got to one where they just would not let me go any farther. And this police officer looked at me and said incredulously, "Where do you think you are going?" And I explained who I was, and I said, "I've got to get to ORMC." And he said, "Not this way, you're not." What I didn't realize was 2 blocks ahead, there was still active gunfire going on, and that stood between me and the emergency department. So I said, "How do I get there?" And he said, "Follow that ambulance." So I followed an ambulance. We took a very circuitous route around all the police roadblocks that were circling the Pulse Nightclub, and eventually was able to get to ORMC. And as I entered the trauma bay, I was struck by all the gurneys that were lined up in the corridor outside the trauma bay. And I will never forget the first gurney that I saw as I pushed the door open. And on that gurney was a pair of beige high heels sticking out from underneath a white sheet, clearly covering the body of a deceased victim. I entered the trauma bay, and it was filled to capacity. There were patients crying, team members rushing from bed to bed, trying to save lives. And I saw Chad in the midst of all this, and I went to him, and he kind of told me what he had in the trauma bay. And he said, "Look, can you go to the operating room? I've already sent one of the senior residents upstairs with a gunshot wound to the abdomen." So I rushed upstairs and helped one of our residents. We rapidly repaired the patient's injuries. And as we finished that first operation of the morning, I spoke with Sandy Mukherjee, who was the anesthesiologist in-house that night. And I let him know what was going on downstairs. And we agreed that we would try and open as many operating rooms as we could, and that we would call the on-call teams in. So I went back downstairs to the trauma bay, which now had even more patients than before. They were lined up left and right. And Chad said, "I really need you to take this patient upstairs to the operating room." It was a young man who had been shot multiple times in the chest and in the abdomen. He was profoundly hypotensive. He was severely bradycardic. And so we rushed him to the elevator and upstairs. En route, he lost his vital signs. So I went ahead and started CPR. And I was faced with a dilemma. Do I continue to try and resuscitate this young man whose chances for survival were probably 0? Or do I stop and do I go on to the next patient, hopefully stop somebody's bleeding so that they could survive from their injuries? You know, it becomes the question of standard of care versus sufficient care that Chad alluded to a moment ago that we have to address in any mass casualty situation. Standard of care is what we all do every day. We try and do everything possible for every patient, sometimes perhaps more than we ought to, especially when the care is clearly futile. But in a mass casualty situation, we have to switch to what we call sufficient care, where we try and do the best that we can for the most patients. It's a difficult decision. It's a decision that can be difficult to make, especially if you're not used to rationing care. So as I was pumping up and down on this young man's chest, trying to bring him back to life, I am pondering this decision and debating what to do. And I happened to look out the open door of the operating room, and I see the next patient being rolled down the hallway to an adjacent operating room. And there was no surgeon with that patient. And so in that moment, I realized what the right decision was. So I stopped CPR, and I turned to the team, and I said, time of death, 3:05. Let's get the next patient. So as I wheeled my patient out of the operating room, I ran into Sandy again, and he said, look, we will get you everything you need. So I've been able to open up 3 operating rooms. I've got a 4th that'll be open soon. And as I started to go back down to the trauma bay, they stopped me and they said, Matt Luby and Will Havron, who are 2 of our trauma surgeon partners, as well as Mark Levy, who's one of the pediatric surgeons who was on call, they had arrived and they were ready to start operating. Our emergency medicine residents, our general surgery residents had started to arrive, and we now had the manpower that we needed. So at that point in time, I realized it was time to change hats. As the Chief Surgical Quality Officer, my role in a disaster would normally be working in our Incident Command Center with our administrators, working to keep the hospital functioning. Now, for those that may not be familiar, Incident Command is a concept that has been adopted from firefighters, where you bring together experienced key personnel from various crucial departments in the hospital, and they are there to make the decisions that will keep a hospital going in a mass casualty situation. So I went downstairs and I ran into Carlos Carrasco, our Chief Operating Officer, and together we began to open up our Incident Command Center. And we began to discuss the fact that we needed more operating room teams. And as we thought about how we would accomplish that, we realized we had those teams already just across the street on our campus at Arnold Palmer Hospital for Children and Winnie Palmer Hospital for Women and Babies. And so we made the decision at that point in time to bring those teams across the street to ORMC, a facility that many had not worked in before. We know that in traumatically injured patients, if we can stop their bleeding and resuscitate them within 60 minutes of injury, we can dramatically improve their survival. And we decided that rather than sending patients to other hospitals or across the street to our 2 sister hospitals, we would bring the staff to ORMC. At that point, Mark Jones arrived, our president. We updated him on our plan. He agreed, and we decided to go ahead and keep all the patients at ORMC so that we could preserve their golden hour and improve their chance for survival.
As I drove into the hospital early that morning, I was still unaware of many details at all associated with what this night was going to bring. I had taken a phone call before 3 a.m., said there were multiple casualties at a nightclub, and that was all the information that we had at that point. I thought I would jump onto Twitter and see if I could see any news at all, any information I could gather that would help before we got in, but it was so early, there was nothing even posted on Twitter yet. And it wasn't until I was driving towards the hospital and I came upon the same flashing lights that Dr. Cheatham mentioned. did I really start to understand the breadth and the depth of the tragedy that was unfolding. It was more law enforcement, more EMS support in one place than I'd ever seen before in my life. I was able to work my way into the hospital and came to the incident command room where Dr. Cheatham and Carlos were setting up. They briefed me quickly, helped me understand the current situation, and then Carlos asked me a really key question. He said, do you want me here in incident command or do you want me out in the hospital? And that was an important question because circumstances were unfolding incredibly quickly. You know, I've served as incident commander several times, many times actually, in my career. And when you serve as incident commander in Central Florida for a hurricane, you have days to plan and to make decisions. This early morning, we had minutes, we had moments, and what we needed at Incident Command were eyes and ears that were out there helping us understand what was happening in real time so that we could help to support. And Carlos was going to serve in that role for us, and I said, please head towards the emergency department and I'll stay close to my phone. We serve as the only level 1 trauma center in Central Florida, and we recognize the deep responsibility that brings with us. There is an immense amount of training and coordination that takes place in preparation for any mass casualty event. In fact, remarkably, just 3 months before the Pulse tragedy, we had a planned community-wide mass casualty drill. And that mass casualty drill was focused on an active shooter. 56 different organizations and agencies that participated in that process. There's no question that the work that was done that day helped to save lives. Hospitals, we would really, really urge you to practice incident command. Drill often. Do the tabletop exercises as often as you can. You need to do this, in our opinion, when it's not convenient. You always think that, you know what, the hospital's too busy. We would urge you to drill when you're busy. Drill at night. Practice on the weekend, because what comes out of that are lessons and learnings and gaps that are identified that allow you to address them and prepare. Also, build your relationships with law enforcement and emergency medical services through those exercises. Get to know each other personally. Those relationships become invaluable in the midst of an awful situation that we faced, and they did an amazing job. It will save lives. So through training and building these relationships, there were so many things that we were prepared for coming into that night, but there were things that, frankly, we weren't prepared for. In those early morning hours, while it was still dark, because it was so early, there were no other community organizations, locations that had opened up yet. And what began to happen is the loved ones and the families of those that were in Pulse started to arrive at our hospital. We were the only place of refuge in those early morning hours. It became clear that we're going to have to spend a lot of focus and energy taking care of them. Holly Stewart arrived in Incident Command, and I said, Holly, I've got something I need you to do.
I woke up that morning a few minutes after 5 and flipped on the television, and that's when I got the news that there had been a mass shooting at the Pulse Nightclub, and that there were 20 confirmed dead and dozens of patients had been taken to ORMC. I sent some quick texts to my team to see who could come in, and I was out the door in 10 minutes. And I pulled into the parking garage. I remember looking at the clock in my car, and it was 5:38 a.m. And as I walked the block from the parking garage, I remember thinking, this is not going to be a normal day. This is not a drill. This is real. And I remember saying a prayer, and I asked specifically for strength and guidance, because I knew that we would be serving people who really needed our help that day. The hospital was under lockdown, and as I walked in, I could see a crowd of people being held outside the front of the hospital, and I would later learn that those were the friends and families looking for their loved ones, the ones who had been at the Pulse. And instead of the friendly faces of our guest service team members standing at the front desk, there was a law enforcement officer dressed in SWAT gear, and he was holding an automatic rifle. I walked over to Incident Command, and Mark pulled me aside and said, "You're not going to be in charge of logistics today, Holly. You're going to be in charge of the family room." And I remember instantly being relieved, and then the enormity of it hit me, and the responsibility of what my team was asked to do that day. I was reminded once again I probably could have been a bit more specific in my prayer request earlier. I'm going to read something to you that I wrote because I received so many messages from friends and family checking on me. Several days later, I wrote this in response to them. We began gathering the families at ORMC before dawn on Sunday and were with them throughout the day while they waited, hoping and praying for miracles and staying connected constantly to their cell phones. We provided nourishment, emotional support, blankets, and gave away so many cell phone chargers that we eventually cleaned out our entire supply from all of our gift shops. They all wanted to know only one thing: where their loved ones were. Were they in the ORMC emergency room, or were they among the 49 victims who lost their lives at Pulse? We worked diligently to comfort them and to keep them informed, all the while knowing that many of them would receive the most devastating news of their lives before it was over. And among those whose loved ones were in fact at ORMC, even the best news they would receive was that their loved one had been shot and traumatized. I'll never forget the desperation, anguish, and raw agony I saw and heard on Sunday and Monday. My heart is hurting beyond description. We cared for these families and loved ones, and there were great efforts going on behind the scenes to try to identify the victims at Pulse and the victims that we had at ORMC. Some of the patients who presented in that first wave, we took in 36 patients in 36 minutes, so it was very, very busy. Some could identify themselves, those who were conscious. Those who weren't, some of them had IDs, some didn't, and some had fake IDs. And so it took the FBI several hours to figure out who we had and who was at Pulse. We asked the people in the family room to send us a current photo of their loved one so we could work behind the scenes to identify who we had. And while this was going on, the mayor of Orlando held a press conference. Instead of the 20 that were confirmed dead, he announced that there were 49, and the tension in the room was enormous at that point. Around 11 o'clock that morning, one of our trauma surgeons, Dr. Joey Ibrahim, came in and read 2 lists. He read a list of the patients that were doing well at another local hospital, and then he read a list of the patients that we had been able to identify at ORMC. He read their names and their conditions. And at the end of those readings, we took those families out to be reunited with their loved one. And then we realized that the rest of the group was most likely going to be getting the worst news of their life. We let them know that we still had several to identify, but the resignation on the faces in that room, I never will forget. Shortly afterward, I got a list of 5 with 5 names on it, and they were 5 of the victims who had made it to the trauma center but had not survived. And the FBI wanted to begin the process of notifying the next of kin, and they wanted to do it at the hospital. The community family room still had not been set up. And their protocol, even though they wanted to do it at our hospital, did not include us. And we felt very insistent that if it was going to happen at the hospital with these families that we had been caring for many hours now, that we needed to be part of that process. As a level 1 trauma center, we are sadly very adept at giving bad news to families on a regular basis. And finally, the FBI agreed. And so for the next 2 hours, one at a time, I brought in those 5 families and to our boardroom at ORMC, and Dr. Hakeem and the FBI agent let them know that their son, their brother, their loved one had in fact passed away at Pulse. We kept the families with us until about 3:30 that afternoon when the family room opened at a hotel about a block north of the hospital, and we walked them over there. And I'm going to tell you a quick story about one of the families that we cared for that day that I think about a lot. It was the family of Daryl Burt, and his father came up to me early in the morning and asked me if I could help him make arrangements to fly home to Indiana. He and his wife had a plane reservation that afternoon, and he didn't think he was going to be able to make it. And Mrs. Burt was very concerned because the only picture she had was of her son who had graduated and received his master's degree the day before, and he was in his cap and gown, and that was the only picture that she had. And we helped him rearrange his flight, and we walked them over to the family room at 3:30. And when I couldn't sleep when I went home that night, and I watched the television and saw Daryl Burt Jr.'s name on the list of people who had died at Pulse, all I could think about was his parents who came to celebrate his graduation, the highest achievement of his life, and they were going home brokenhearted without him. I think about the Burts a lot. We learned a lot that day about a family room. When we have drilled for family rooms in the past, we set up a location and we put in some creature comforts like water and blankets, but now we know there is so much more to it. The families that we cared for that day, we had so many emotional needs that we needed grief counselors. They had so many spiritual needs that we needed our chaplains. They had so many medical needs that we needed our clinicians in there to care for them. And in this particular case, it was Latin night at the Pulse Club, and so the primary language being spoken in the room was Spanish, and we needed translators to help with that cultural difference. The other main thing that we learned was the clinical aspect of this incident was over relatively quickly. We took in another trauma victim from a car accident at 10 a.m. that morning. We had 500 other patients in the hospital that weekend, and we decided to keep our full schedule of surgeries the next day. I believe we had 70 surgeries scheduled the next day, and we decided we needed to keep those as well. But what we weren't prepared for was the aftermath of the incident, which went on for months and still continues to this day. The families that we kept, the next day we had about 30 families still in the hospital. We actually assigned non-clinical managers to them to help them navigate through the situation they now found themselves in. We helped them find places to stay. We helped them get other family members here. We helped them understand the law enforcement needs and the community services that were being applied to them. We were overwhelmed with people who wanted to come visit the patients and their families and to support our team. And so we actually brought in additional corporate resources from our community and government relations areas, our marketing team, and the Orlando Health Foundation to help us manage all of those visits. And then we were simply overwhelmed with the outpouring of support that we received from the community from around the country, and in many cases from you all, of the gifts that arrived every single day for the victims, their families, and for our team. We got boxes of greeting cards handmade by kindergarten classes. We had floral vans pull up and deliver 50 bouquets of flowers at once. We had more pizza than we knew what to do with. And then there were the beautiful banners that you all sent. And you couldn't help but be moved by the support we felt from you all when you walked through the lobby of our buildings and you would see posters and banners with handwritten messages on them. And you would see a different message routinely. Someone pointed out one to me in the emergency room with a very simple message that said, "Humanity thanks you." And when we look around the building and we see those of you who have been through what we were going through, and we felt the care that you gave us, we were so honored by that. And you just had to walk through the lobby and see banners from Boston and Oklahoma City and Loma Linda and Aurora, Colorado and Blacksburg, Virginia, just to name a few. There was no real estate left within the hospital to hang these banners, and we so appreciated it. And we now feel the obligation and the responsibility and the honor of paying that forward. We have blank banners in our administration office now ready to be signed, and just 2 weeks after our incident, we sent 2 to hospitals in Dallas who cared for the police officers who were shot there during their tragedy. And it continues. Right before Thanksgiving, we had 250 handmade quilts delivered from all over the country. They were delivered by the Orlando Quilting Guild. Yes, there really is one. And they were made for our team members who worked on June 12th. And they have a very simple message on them that says, "We hope these comfort you as much as you comfort others" on June 12th. And Mark is going to talk a little bit more about how much our team needed comfort.
So there are 6 of us on stage this morning, but we represent thousands and thousands of others that were a part of caring for the victims of the Pulse tragedy. In fact, at Orlando Health, we say, even if you weren't there that day, you were there. And everybody played a part, everybody had a role and supported those that were there that day. And we really mean that. We're also very grateful for those that came before us, those that had a passion and a commitment to trauma, to medical education, who pushed us to be better than we were the day before, and we're grateful for them. We're also deeply, deeply committed to each other, and our concern for each other extends to the emotional needs. And that morning, we had cared for the patients, for the victims that arrived. We had cared for the families and the loved ones. And we also made sure that we were caring for each other. We set up, by midday, classrooms that allowed for counseling to take place. These were opportunities for the whole team to come and to sit down together. There were professional counselors there to support. The team needed to be together. They needed to see each other, they needed to talk about what they had just experienced, to support each other. We ran those sessions every 2 hours for the first 3 days, into the night, into the next day. And we believe that that was a huge part of our responsibility through this process to care for our team. It's consistent with the culture that we have at Orlando Health. The counseling and the support continues. We recognize that as we move towards certain anniversary dates, and we talked about the 6-month date, those will be emotional times as well, and we're prepared to do that for some days to come. There's one more issue that really began to present itself that morning, and it was emerging quickly and significantly, and that was the media's response. And in the early morning, I turned to Dr. Cheatham and I said, I have something else I need you to do. This will be his 3rd role that morning.
You know, within a few hours of this tragedy, the streets surrounding the medical center were lined by press trucks. You've seen the pictures from events such as this on the news. And in Incident Command, we started getting numerous phone calls and texts and emails from local, national, and international news agencies, all clamoring for information. They wanted to know about the victims that we were caring for. And as Mark said, he turned to me and he said, "I would like you to serve as the physician spokesman for the hospital." And I hopefully masked my fear at that point. And of course, I had to say yes. I'm a trauma surgeon. I was trained as a surgeon. 3 years ago, I stepped into the role of the Chief Surgical Quality Officer and have been able to learn the very valuable lessons of quality improvement. I was never trained to stand in front of a TV camera and give interviews. Over the next few days, weeks, and even months, my physician and nurse partners, all of our team members have given countless numbers of interviews to the media. We've been asked to speak at meetings around the country. And that has been difficult because every time we do something like this, we relive that morning. We've all seen this video several times, but I'll tell you that every time we watch it, it pulls at each of our hearts, and for the suffering and the tragedy of that event. It's been difficult to move on as a result because we do have to relive the event on a regular basis, but the interactions that we've had with colleagues around the country has been very beneficial in that we've learned in these conversations that many hospitals do not have a plan for how they would respond to a mass casualty event such as this. As Chad said in the video, he quoted Ben Franklin, who said, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. We cannot encourage you strongly enough, as you've heard from several of us already, that if you don't have a plan, you need to make one. It is not a question of if you are going to be faced with an event like this. It is a question of when. You need to go back, you need to plan, you need to prepare, and as Mark said, you need to practice, 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 so that you are ready when patients need you.
After the incident was winding down and the patients were transferred out of the operating room into the ICU, we walked around the emergency department and tallied up the stickers that you saw on the monitor to make sure that everyone was accounted for. And the team members that night or that morning that were coming off of their shift, they were tired, they were exhausted, but they were still determined to care for all of these patients. Those that were coming on were somewhat anxious as to what their day had in front of them, but they were also somewhat regretful that they hadn't been there to help in the middle of the night. And I believe this is truly part of our team culture with empathy for what each other goes through that enabled us to mount a response that was of this magnitude. Over the first 24 hours, 29 operative procedures were performed, 441 units of blood products were transfused, and 417 team members came to help with the Pulse incident. The first week, 54 procedures were performed, all the while caring for 500 patients in the hospital and continuing with elective surgeries. Nearly 80 operative procedures have been performed to date, and some patients still have procedures yet to be done, in a staged fashion down the road. Some of the patients stayed hours, and some patients stayed days. Some patients stayed months to weeks. Those patients and their family members, however, will remain in all of our hearts forever.
I think about all those numbers that Dr. Smith just read, and all I can think about is love. And the amount of love that we at Orlando Health have for our patients and for what we do, for the love that came from the community that surrounded us and helped us heal. I think about the love and the trust that I have for my team that is like no other, that I had faith that Dr. Smith was making the right decisions because I knew that he loved us and he loved his team, and I knew that I loved the nurses beside of me. I just had such a sense of pride and love, and the only thing that helps me get through this sometimes is just thinking, it's hard, it's sad, and in the face of such hate, the only thing that can ever, ever change that is love. And I know what love is because I was there that night.
As you listened to their firsthand accounts, you heard stories about the intersection of preparedness with the unforeseeable. You heard the confidence of an empowered front line who's empowered to innovate in the clinical care of patients and empowered to innovate in the emotional care of the loved ones and the family members. We did a lot of things well. We're proud of a lot of things. We did the clinical side of things extremely well. And that was because of years of planning and years of preparation and being the backstop for all of the most difficult trauma cases in the region. Often those patients would come in 2s or 3s or 4s, but never in 30s or 40s. Our planning and preparation, and especially our ownership of our responsibility to our communities was outstanding. As you heard, we also took great care of our front line, of our team for their emotional and their spiritual needs. There was a lot that we couldn't have been prepared for. There was no plan in our plan for a mass shooting just blocks away. There was no plan for most of the patients coming to just one hospital. No plan for 44 victims, 36 in 36 minutes. We had no plan for making moral and ethical decisions necessary in battlefield-like triage conditions. We had no plan for EMS delivering a minority of the patients and most of the patients coming in the back of pickup trucks or the back of police vehicles without the benefit of a phone call from EMS saying, here's the casualty coming in, you have a 10-minute notice. We had to innovate in the identification of dozens of John Does and Jane Does, and we had to work around HIPAA rules. We had to innovate in the handling of all the families, not just the families of the loved ones who were in our hospitals alive, but the loved ones of those of the dead who still were on the floor of the Pulse Nightclub. Those families, every time we came to announce the condition and the name of one of our living victims, to watch the anguish on their face as they learned that theirs wasn't that loved one. We had to innovate in working with EMS. We had to innovate in working with all of the governmental agencies and the law enforcement agencies, and in the handling of the media, and in the handling of the dignitaries and the VIPs, and all of the Hollywood stars, and all the high-end athletes, and all the politicians, and the governor, and the senators, and the president. We had to innovate in the outpouring of all the love from the entire country, as Holly stated, in the form of banners and gifts and pizzas. And we had to quickly create a structure to handle the emotional needs of our front line and the grieving of our front line. Ours is a story of mission and passion, of preparedness and planning, and of success, and as you can see, a bit of pride in being able to handle that which is really beyond preparation. Our question, as you've heard, for you is, are you prepared? Are you prepared for the worst to show up on your doorstep unannounced? Is your team confident? Are they confident to the point that they'll create solutions in a moment without fear, without the benefit of running something up the chain of command? Much of what we are and how we responded to this tragedy had to do with our recent years of working closely with the IHI. Their culture of driving towards excellence and their emphasis on the power of teamwork, it was invaluable for us. And we've learned the importance of empowering the front line. We really want to thank the IHI for helping us develop our culture over the past years. The Pulse tragedy brought out the best in us in what we would say was the worst of times. So we want to close with a thank you to the individuals and the communities, and especially the hospitals, for their outpouring of love and concern and passion for us. One of those health systems was Albany Medical Center. They sent us a video that they produced, a 5-minute video from their frontline trauma team giving their thanks and bonding with us and letting us know how proud we made them as health caregivers and how proud we made the entire nation of hospitals in our performance. And they closed with this in that video. They said, "You may not remember every life you touched that day, but every life you touched will certainly remember you." So are you prepared for that which you can prepare? And are you prepared, and is your team prepared for that which you can't prepare? Thank you.